Buenos días o buenas
Good
tardes.
morning or good afternoon to everyone. I am Carla Sainz, the Regional Bioethics Advisor at the Pan American Health Organization. And before we formally open our session, I want to give you instructions on how to use simultaneous interpretation because we are going to have presentations in both English and Spanish. In order to hear the interpretation, please click on the globe icon that you can find under interpretation at the bottom of your Zoom screen towards the right. If you don't see the globe icon, then click the little circle that says more with 3 dots. After you click on that globe icon, you can then click on the language that you would like to listen to.
I'm Carla Sainz, and before starting with the session, I want to make sure that you know how to listen to the session in English if this is what you want. So please go to the little globe that says interpretation on the bottom right of your Zoom screen. If you do not see it, you will find if you click on that circle with the 3 dots that says more. So once you click on that little globe, you can choose English if that's the language where you wanna choose. You wanna listen to your to the entire session today. Ahora retornamos al español.
Now I'm going back to Spanish. Welcome to another session of our PAHO webinar series related to the ethics of clinical trials. This is an organized effort of the Regional Bioethics Program of Science and Research for Impact under Evidence and Intelligence for Action in Health of the Pan American Health Organization under the unit of the Quality and Regulation of Health Technology and Medicines of PAHO and our program of innovation, access to medicines and health technology. I'm not certain what the number of this webinar is in the series, but we also invite you to find the recordings of our previous webinars on the website of the Regional Bioethics Program of the Pan American Health Organization. A few other housekeeping matters before we get started. We would be very appreciative if you could post your questions in either Spanish, English, or Portuguese in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. If you have any general comments or want to share links or other information with everyone, please just post those in the chat section of your screen. We will not be issuing a certificate for participation in this session. This session will be recorded, and we will offer versions of the recording in both English and in Spanish through our bioethics mailing list. It's also going to be available on the bioethics website and the clinical trials portal of PAHO. And we also invite you to subscribe to our ethical research mailing list so that we can inform you of the next webinar, which will be on August 26th. And this will be the final presentation of our new regional clinical trial contract, our model contract. So for today's session, I am going to share a few opening slides because I did want to kick off this discussion by talking about the progress that we have made in the region in terms of ethical research with pregnant participants. PAHO has insisted that research must be conducted with pregnant participants, and we have been stressing this since the Zika epidemic. And we looked at clinical trials on Zika treatment with this publication on pregnant women and the Zika virus vaccine and how it should be part of the research agenda. Another co-author of that document will be presenting today, and then we looked at research to be done with pregnant women. Our efforts to advocate for ethical research with pregnant people has encountered many obstacles. For example, I'm talking about the existing regulatory barriers, both in terms of ethical frameworks and also in the regulatory frameworks of the countries, and I'm going to clarify that for you in a moment. In addition, other problems are because there is a perception, a misperception that pregnant women are a vulnerable population and protecting them means they must be excluded from research. In addition, another issue is that there is limited capacity still, even though that capacity is quickly growing, to conduct rigorous research. And we have a tradition in which there is little trust in the parties involved in conducting and carrying out research, and above all, in the ethics of research systems. Within a situation of limited capacity, lack of trust, it is always easier to simply categorically ban the inclusion of pregnant women. It seems to be easier to do that than to do the necessary rigorous studies. For this comparison, we must draw a distinction between ethical supervision of all research on human subjects and what is known as regulatory oversight, with a whole subset of research on human subjects, which is with medicines or devices or vaccines that seek a certain product. That compared to ethical research, which includes all research on human subjects with a duly accredited ethics committee and with certain guidelines. Added to this is oversight by the National Regulatory Authority in light of good clinical practices as established by the International Harmonization Conference, which is done by the National Regulatory Authority. In terms of barriers in the existing standards, and I'm referring by this both to regulations that have to do with the large set of research on human subjects, such as those that specifically govern clinical trials that seek a new registry in countries. These lines are still a bit blurry, but these regulatory barriers generally refer to restrictions because it has been perceived that pregnant people are vulnerable. And we specify additional barriers to research on vulnerable persons. In addition, regulations often limit research on pregnancy strictly to pregnancy issues such as preeclampsia and the lack of medication for depression. In addition, many of these require the automatic exclusion if pregnancy should occur while someone is already participating in a study. Sometimes this requires mandatory consent by the partner of the pregnant woman, the spouse, or whoever that may be. And in general terms, they require for a single way to handle all cases without taking into account the level of risk of the specific study or even the potential individual benefit that the study subject may gain. So there has been progress within the region, and there are some aspects of this that are intimately related. First of all, there's been substantial strengthening of national research ethics systems. We have ethical standards that have been improved for regulation of clinical studies that have been revised. We also have very substantive training on ethics at various levels, and there is much more trust in the research ethics system. And as people participate in the tasks of that system. In addition, there is a pillar of progress in the area of research with pregnant subjects, and these are the international ethics of the CIOMS of 2016, which is related to health studies on human subjects, which PAHO translated into Spanish. We're going to speak about those guidelines very briefly. This entails a change of paradigm for the participation of pregnant women in research. First of all, if you look at guideline 3, and I'm going to talk a lot about this, just a quick overview, just to remind you of some central aspects of it. Guideline 3 indicates categorically that the categorical exclusion of populations that have been historically excluded from research is an injustice that we have the moral duty to repair. In other words, we must foster research on these populations, including pregnant women who have historically been excluded from this research. And what must be done is that each exclusion from a study must be justified. Categorical exclusion is no longer ethically acceptable. In addition, the CIOMS guidelines also clearly indicate that pregnancy per se is not sufficient reason for exclusion. A woman cannot be excluded simply because she's pregnant. And we have to look at some specific situations and practices. People might think that women are less capable of protecting their own interests, therefore are more vulnerable. So we have to look at the basis of these reasoning and must do a more rigorous analysis of specific cases instead of applying across the board bans or categorical across the board inclusion as well.
Entonces, ahora, sin más preámbulo, quiero invitar a
Without
la
further
doctora
ado, I would like to invite Dr. Carly Krubiner, who is an expert in bioethics and a global health policy expert. She works at Wellcome in the United Kingdom. She does many things related to the ethics of research and participates in the strategic investments portfolio and the global bioethics scene, and she has a series of bioethics networks in terms of global health. But the most important thing is that Carly has worked extensively on research issues during pregnancy over the past 10 years. Since the Zika epidemic. It's hard to believe it's already been 10 years, but it's a pleasure to have you with us, Carly. You have the floor.
Great. Thanks so much, Carla. I'm just going to pull up my slides, but it is a pleasure to be with you all today. Sorry, just one moment. Yes, so it's a pleasure to be with you all today to talk about an issue that is near and dear to my heart, the ethical inclusion of pregnant participants in clinical research. And as Carla mentioned, I've had the joy of working with Carla, with Flor, with a number of other colleagues on this topic for, I think it's actually closer to 15 years now. Yeah, we have, as Carla said, seen quite a bit of progress in that time, but there's still much more room to go. So before I get into some of the specific guidance points and principles and ways that we'll think about assessing risk and benefit across the maternal fetal dyad, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the background of the problem and why it is such a disservice to pregnant people and their offspring to not conduct research with them appropriately. So we know that there is nothing about pregnancy that protects people from falling ill, and that people who have chronic illnesses can also fall pregnant. Pregnant women get sick, sick women become pregnant. Um, but despite this fact, that's widely acknowledged, drugs and biologics and other biomedical interventions are rarely developed with pregnant women in mind as the end users. We also know that the vast majority of women take at least one medication during their pregnancy, and that most medications and biologics go to market without human data on safety, efficacy, dosing in pregnancy. One study about 10 years ago estimated that it can take up to 27 years after the licensure of a product to actually characterize these risks if they're not done before they're authorized. So that's a whole generation of people falling pregnant without having appropriate data to inform how they use different types of drugs, medicines, vaccines with the right type of rigorous data that we would want to make informed decisions. Furthermore, we know that pregnancy isn't just being a human with a big belly. There are unique physiological characteristics and considerations that relate to how we think about different types of biomedical intervention and also the presentation of disease. So we know pregnancy can cause dynamic changes in how we metabolize drugs, in respiratory function, in cardiac output, in the immune system, particularly across the maternal fetal dyad, as well as changes in the reproductive tract, and that these can also vary across different gestational periods. These changes can also affect the susceptibility, severity, and presentation of disease, and they can have implications for what the right dosing level is of different interventions and their overall efficacy. And of course, the very obvious one that usually gets the most attention is that there can be unique risks in pregnancy, both for the pregnant woman herself, but also that potential for fetal risk and fetal harm. We've also seen this play out quite significantly in the past several years with various emerging infectious diseases and outbreaks, where pregnant women and their offspring have been among the most severely impacted and at risk of death, severe disease, and lifelong disability. Whether it was in Ebola, where we saw huge case fatality rates ranging between 60 to 90% across different outbreaks, and a near 100% fetal loss rate for women infected during pregnancy. Zika is also a clear example where there were severe congenital harms of the virus itself when infected during pregnancy on newborn infants or on pregnancy outcomes. And despite the fact that we know infectious diseases can cause huge problems in pregnancy and more severely present, we've only had one vaccine to date that's been specifically licensed for use in pregnancy, and that was only in the past couple of years for RSV. So even though we have been operating on this presumption of exclusion, on perils of precaution, there really is huge impacts in terms of what that means for pregnant people and their offspring. We know that the absence of trial evidence can contribute to exclusionary policies that either delay or outright deny access to life-saving medications or vaccines for pregnant people. Even when there is access, there's often hesitancy amongst pregnant people, as well as their providers, to use treatments and vaccines that would be really beneficial to them and to their unborn babies. And ultimately, what happens is that when we don't conduct this research, we push the risks from that research space where we can control them, quickly detect if there's an adverse event, and mitigate and minimize those risks to the clinical care context where they're uncontrolled, where many more people could be exposed, and where that risk is much greater. So we've been operating on this presumption of exclusion, which is a vicious cycle where pregnant women have been excluded from the research enterprise. Then we lack the evidence we need to inform care, and they're excluded from receiving beneficial interventions in delivery and care contexts. And this feeds back into a perpetuated cycle of exclusion and evidence gaps on a wide range of products and platforms. So where do we go from here? A number of the guidance pieces that I've worked on with a range of colleagues have set forth foundational principles for research with pregnant people. And much of this will sound and resonate similarly with what Carla had mentioned from the CEOM's guidance. The first is to acknowledge that pregnant people need and deserve an evidence base on the prevention and treatment modalities that address their health needs, just as others do, and that this is a matter of justice. The second principle is that pregnant women should not be categorized as vulnerable, particularly in the context of human subjects research, and that this is a matter of respect, respecting that they have their own autonomy, that they can make decisions, and that they are not vulnerable simply by being pregnant. The third foundational principle is that justice requires pregnant people have fair access to research that offers a prospect of direct benefit. This has two components. The first is a fair opportunity to benefit from participating in research that their non-pregnant peers would be offered. So if they have a health condition where there isn't an available intervention, but they could be benefited by participating in a trial, and this often arises in the context of a public health emergency or emerging infection when we don't have very good or authorized interventions at the start, they should be offered those opportunities to enroll where they can benefit. And the second is to make sure that we acknowledge that pregnant people consent to that research is sufficient for this participation. And I know Carla mentioned that there are many contexts in which a partner's consent is required in order for enrolling. And this is something that we think is unethical and unjustifiable. The last foundational principle is to just acknowledge that it is not only ethically permissible to do research with pregnant participants, but it is morally required and imperative, with the caveat that we need to have appropriate risk standards. So when we're thinking about risk standards, we generally group research into two categories. There's the first category, when there is no prospect of direct benefit to the pregnant person, to the future child, or both. And in these instances, for these types of trials, we generally try to cap research-related risks at a relatively low threshold. And this often shows up either as a minimal risk standard or many, including the PREGLAC guidance, advocate for a minor increase over minimal risk, which would enable really important pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic studies, which are important for dosing and making sure we actually get that understanding right of how the body is distributing those medications. The second category is when there is a prospect of direct benefit, either to the pregnant person directly, to the future child, and usually both. And in this instance, we have to be assessing risk in relation to the prospect of direct benefit across the maternal fetal dyad, ideally by those who have the appropriate expertise to determine favorable versus unfavorable risk-benefit ratios. So collectively, we're hoping that these principles and the guidance that sit behind them can move and shift that paradigm to a presumption of inclusion, where we're appropriately including pregnant people in research studies. We generate better evidence that can inform appropriate inclusion in clinical rollout and implementation, and that we can enhance the evidence base for future use, not just of those particular interventions, but also contribute to greater knowledge about biomedical interventions that can shape future research and development and use in pregnancy. I did want to offer a little bit of explanation about what we mean by the presumption of inclusion, in part by saying what it doesn't mean. So we are not saying that this means that pregnant people have to be enrolled in every single research trial, in every clinical study. We're not talking about first-in-human studies where you have a really small N and really uncharacterized risks. The idea really is to shift that default, because right now the default is to exclude. And right now we want to shift the default to inclusion, where you would have to justify an exclusion. So essentially saying we include pregnant women in biomedical research and development unless there is a good scientific and ethical justification for their exclusion. And often that will come down to an unfavorable risk-benefit ratio for how we think about justifiable exclusion. So moving on to the risks and benefits across the dyad. So this is a really interesting and complex area because it's one of the few situations in the research context where we're looking at a risk-benefit ratio where there are two entities to consider. And we have risks and benefits for both parties that we have to consider simultaneously, and on the rare occasion, make trade-offs. And often the way that this is positioned is as a trade-off between maternal benefit and fetal risk, which I think is actually doing a huge disservice to the field. and in many ways is really a myth. Because what actually more often happens is that the health and well-being of the mother and baby tend to co-travel. They're very rarely in conflict. And this is because we know that a healthy mother is critical to the healthy development of a fetus and future baby. We also know that for many interventions, they're directly targeted at the well-being of infants. For example, maternal immunizations, many of them are primarily targeted for offering immune protection in infants, as is the case for RSV and Group B strep. We also know that many of the ways in which we actually serve to protect pregnant people from severe disease or to manage disease during pregnancy carry significant benefits for the fetus and future child as well. Not just in terms of directly having a healthy gestational environment and a living mother, but also in the case of vaccines, there's the additional conferred benefit of transplacental antibody transfer. One of the other areas that has been really troubling in this space is that very often people tend to forget about the benefits, and there's this over focus on the risks of fetal harm. Everybody's very nervous about causing fetal harm, and we can understand that impulse. But very often these are theoretical risks, while we're not actually understanding what the benefit is, both to the fetus as well as to the gestating mom. And one colleague has suggested that maybe instead of thinking about this as a risk-benefit ratio, we should actually be thinking about this as a risk-risk assessment. Instead, thinking about the risk of infection of a deadly or severe pathogen versus the risk of vaccination, which is an easier way to think about the risk of, for instance, Ebola versus the risk of an Ebola vaccine. Similarly, if we're thinking about the risk of uncontrolled maternal disease versus a risk of medication, it often makes it a little bit easier to assess what we're actually trading off rather than over focusing on the theoretical risk of fetal harm associated with an intervention that we've yet to characterize, or that we're often relying solely on theoretical risks or animal data. So one way we tried to detail this out, and I'll spend not too much time on this because I know Flora is going to talk much more about the vaccine space, but we tried to break this down to what this might actually look like in the case of vaccines against emerging epidemic threats, by essentially breaking down the category into 6 different sets of considerations that look across both the maternal and fetal space. So thinking about the likelihood of infection of a particular pathogen, so trying to characterize what the risk of exposure is, the susceptibility, and in the case of pregnancy, really also thinking about the potential for vertical transmission and that the pathogen can cross the placenta and infect the baby. The second is the probability and severity of the harms associated with infection. And again, looking across the maternal, obstetric, and potentially future child harms, for instance, with Zika, of longer term impacts on living children. And paying attention as well to the gestational timing of that type of exposure, whether it's early in pregnancy versus later. The third switches to thinking about the intervention itself, the prospect of immune protection from vaccines, and again, basing it on the existing data that we have. So trying to understand what the immune responses look like, at least from non-pregnant participants, and understanding if there's any bridging or assumptions that we can make to assess risk-benefit in the context of pregnancy, or from correlates of protection, if that is known or characterized for a vaccine. And then the likelihood and the severity of vaccine-associated harms. So if we have different types of vaccine products, some of which may offer different risks of fever, some of them are based on non-replication competent vaccines, some of them are live attenuated, trying to understand for that particular product what the likelihood or severity would be of any vaccine-associated harms for the woman and or her offspring. And again, we can look at some of that data on safety and reactogenicity. And then the last set of categories is related to whether or not there are safe or effective alternatives that are available. And often there aren't, or the preventives and treatments that are available also lack safety and efficacy data in pregnancy. So really trying to make sure what's the best available option given the current context and given the need to meet an urgent health need. So I'll end just by flagging that there has been a lot of development in the space. There are a lot of resources out there and even more work being done to try and pull together different types of toolkits, resources, guidance pieces. And I just wanted to flag a few that I think have a good set of considerations and additional resources to flag. So the first is the WHO Antiretrovirals in Pregnancy Research Toolkit that offers a range of guidance pieces, resources that can accelerate the inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding populations in research. And this is categorized both by ethics guidance as well as specific trial design considerations, how you might look at pharmacokinetics, pharmacodynamics, and links out to a number of other resources. I also wanted to flag that there was a workshop last year by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, looking at building on previous HHS guidance to support the inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in clinical research. And the workshop really looked at sort of the current state of evidence generation, what the barriers are and what the opportunities are to accelerate and facilitate inclusion of pregnant and lactating people in clinical trials. And that also links out to a number of other resources. So it's a good sort of first port of call, depending on the type of research that you're doing, for where there might be other tools available. And the last, I'll just kind of link up to our next speaker, Flor Munoz, who worked with a number of the members of the COVAX maternal immunization working group to develop a template tool for the evaluation of vaccines for emerging pathogens for breastfeeding and pregnant women. So with that, I'll end with some acknowledgements of the projects that I've been a part of and colleagues that I've worked with over the last several years that have underpinned some of the guidance I've shared with you today, starting in the early 2010s with the second wave initiative through to the phases and prevent guidance, and some of the more recent work that we did around COVID vaccines. So thank you very much. And with that, I will stop sharing and I'll turn the floor over to Flor.
Thank you so much, Carly. I'm gonna introduce Flor now. I think this is, we're having fantastic series of presentations, and I'm excited that Flor is with us. La doctora Flor Muñoz es doctora en medicina, es profesora de pediatría, enfermedades infecciosas.
Flor Muñoz is Associate Professor of Pediatrics, Infectious Diseases, and Molecular Virology and Microbiology at Baylor College. She's the chair of an ethics committee at Baylor College of Medicine, where she also plays a role as a researcher. So she will be sharing her views considering this multiplicity of points of view that Flor has. So over to you, Flor. It's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you, Carla, and good morning, all of you, for being here. And I'm going to share my screen. My slides are in English, but I'm going to be speaking in Spanish. And in fact, first of all, it is a pleasure to be here with you to bring my perspective on what I have been working on for the last 30 years regarding research in special populations, for example, with vaccines during pregnancy. And this is a list of things that I have done in the recent past. I belong to safety committees and research, vaccine research committees, and research in general, as Carla mentioned. So this is part of where I've been in the past years. We've heard a lot about pregnant women as the subject of research, and from the regulatory standpoint, from the research point of view, I would like to discuss about these people. And it is not only pregnant women, but also infants and fetuses and older people and other persons who may be subject to certain vulnerability, and there's the word, and we need to respect their research rights. We also have racial or ethnic minorities and different socioeconomic groups or different level of education, and groups that are displaced geographically because of conflict and war. When the regulation research code mentions these vulnerable populations, it's not a matter that they cannot make their own decisions to participate in a research project. Especially for pregnant women, but they're categorized as special populations because they need special protections for participation. In the case of pregnant persons and the elderly and children, they may need certain considerations regarding their anatomy, their physiology, so that they can safely participate in research in pregnancy. As has been explained already, we are talking about the dyad between the mother and the fetus. And definitely what happens with these populations is that as part of protecting them, they need to be excluded to early trials, initial trials of many vaccines and medications. But there has been some evolution, as we will see, regarding acceptance and participation into clinical trials, and also the guides and regulatory mechanisms for these populations. One of the recent examples of what happens if we do not include these special populations in our research projects or in our clinical trials, and if we exclude them automatically by default, as happened with COVID, as happened with children, pregnant people, and people with high risk for different reasons, is that we didn't have any appropriate information, or we didn't have too much information basically about these vaccines on these populations, and this led to a delay in utilizing these vaccines in these populations. For example, clearly seen in children. Children started to be vaccinated very late, and this implies high risk that these people may acquire the disease and be victims and not be protected as they need be protected by these interventions, either they be vaccines or medications, because decisions need to be based on evidence. And therefore, it's been necessary to promote and advocate for having early inclusion, or finding a way in which these populations are not excluded from clinical trials on an early phase. A recent situation is that, for example, the exclusion presumption that existed was faced during the Ebola outbreak in the DRC. There were vaccines to potentially save people's lives, but they excluded pregnant women. Uh, a large percentage of women who become infected with Ebola will die. So what happened is, and it goes up to 90%. So it was deemed unacceptable to exclude pregnant women from these studies. So the decision to include them in clinical trials during a critical period was supported by the Minister of Health and the WHO. So they started using this intervention. This is very significant because it gives us a precedent of something real that had prevented the use of these vaccines, which could have saved the diet of mother and fetus, because there were a set of regulations that were not being appropriately interpreted. And here we have other special important situations when we talk about the diet. We have one single vaccine that has been licensed and approved by regulatory committees to use during pregnancy, and it is the SVR vaccine. Most vaccines, such as influenza, whooping cough, COVID, were not specifically evaluated in studies that included pregnant women and which had that as their objective. So we see once again that we need to consider what you've already heard before. And I love showing this table. When we talk about pregnancy, where in this figure I show you a triangle with baseline risks that are related exclusively to pregnancy. There could be vaccination or there could be a condition, and you see the different risks and consequences. But we first need to understand the burden of disease and how much of this burden is caused in the pregnant woman and compare it to the potential risk, which sometimes is theoretical, caused by a vaccine. And for this reason, we need to have preclinical, clinical data of non-pregnant people who allow us to figure out whether we can use that vaccine or that treatment during pregnancy. This has been used for COVID, whooping cough for infants, and flu for the mother. So that's the process, and see all the opportunities we may have. And this has been mentioned before. And let me show you more. In the case of Ebola, we've seen in Lassa fever, hepatitis, malaria, chikungunya, oropuche, and all of these are possibilities where vaccines could be used. They already exist, only if, and we could use them only if we had specific information about pregnant women. So what is critical for including women who are pregnant, we need to have knowledge about the vaccine, what other risks there can be, what is the base of prematurity, for example, and if this can be increased or not with the disease or the vaccine, to have an assessment of what is the potential benefit, what is the potential efficacy for the mother, the fetus, the infant. And this is of great importance to consider. And as we've said before, there have been things that we don't know yet about immunology, transfer of antibodies, etc. But all of this can be done through research. So changes have happened, and very quickly, let me go over this. Changes in the regulatory ethical milieu for investigating vaccines during pregnancy. And so before the 60s, pregnant women used to drink, smoke, and they really didn't take many precautions regarding what they could take or eat. Then we had the situation with thalidomide, which was used to try to decrease nausea during pregnancy. And there was out of indications, and it was brought from outside the United States. This led to some teratogenic effects, as we know, and this led to going to the other extreme, just preventing any kind of use of drugs or other treatments and preventives during pregnancy. So we see we can include women and children for their own benefit, and this has evolved over time. And not a long time has elapsed. It was after the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and with several changes, introducing trials to see how medications work in the pediatric group, that pregnant people were included. In the United States, the National Institutes of Health started requiring the inclusion of women, and all women in general, not necessarily pregnant, in clinical studies since the 90s, and that policy was then implemented. I personally worked in studies funded and approved and supported by the National Health Institute, started in 1990, and we see how we did studies on Streptococcus B, pertussis, syncytial virus, influenza, and they went through several phases of research from the preclinical in animal models, toxicity studies, and then early phase 1 and phase 2 clinical trials to be able to obtain a little more information. And there were very few guidelines back then, but we were able to publish some protocols to learn how to design these studies to make sure that we were focusing on efficacy and safety of vaccines. And this is one of the initial products. And yes, there were, and there is a regulatory pathway to consider how and when to include pregnant people in clinical trials. And I'm showing it here because many times we think they do not exist. But this is more or less the journey here. Presence of preclinical data, potential toxicity, and especially toxic effect on the reproductive system that can lead to teratogenic effects. And this is very useful to have it. Second, to have clinical studies in non-pregnant people, including women of reproductive age and childbearing age, and this will give us data on dosage and immunogenicity. After that, we can go to clinical trials in pregnant women. Phase 1 or 2, we see small safety studies. We are trying to understand the immunogenicity of the vaccine. And phase 3, for example, in RSV, and we have large populations where the efficacy or the immunogenicity of the vaccine are corroborated, and also security or safety. It's important to have safety preset definitions of AE and SAE monitoring and documentation, halting, stopping rules, and also having background rates, control groups, and also post-authorization safety surveillance plans. And again, let me discuss ethics a little bit, only because you've heard about ethics already. For example, Dr. Carla Sainz showed you data on the CIOMs from 2008, after several publications were made. And also you heard Carly talking about the fact that in the past 20 years, there have been very many changes regarding promoting inclusion of pregnant people in clinical trials. And now, fast forward to COVID, and during COVID, we started talking about a change in paradigm where instead of automatically excluding women by default, and we talk about both pregnant and lactating women because we have the option of protecting them. And this is a summary of what I thought could be opportunities to include pregnant women in research from the influenza pandemic in 2009, which opened our eyes regarding the importance of including and having data in this significant group. Also, Ebola, we mentioned Zika also, and also the COVID pandemic, but also we have chikungunya, oropuche, hepatitis E, and mpox, etc. And here on the other side, you have a long list where the SVR is the RSV is the only virus that is currently included officially. Now, let me show you that to recap, how can we ensure that we will have early inclusion of pregnant women in clinical trials? First of all, we needed to consider having a minimum of information or data that provide us with information indicating that the medication is safe and efficacious in non-pregnant populations, and then we need to start including special populations. And so if something is providing protection for a non-pregnant person, it should also be efficacious for the pregnant person, and we should have a bridge between the two. We could also have some minimal safety studies and immunogenicity studies. We could begin then to include women in phase 2 or phase 3 studies before trials are finished. I also talked about toxicology, and it would be important to have protocols. If a woman becomes pregnant in a study where she shouldn't have been pregnant, she could continue to participate to collect information, and then also evaluation post authorization about safety and effectiveness. This is what Carly mentioned. We published this in Vaccine, and this was an effort that emerged from COVID when we had to consider a situation where a pandemic made us skip the step of doing direct evaluations in pregnant women in trials, but we had to use that idea of risk of the disease versus risk of the vaccine with data that we had collected in a non-pregnant adults. Then we considered what the criteria should really be to determine that a vaccine is appropriate or not to use during pregnancy. So this group, supported by CEPI and with Brighton now, we put together a proposal which tries to give researchers and regulatory groups and committees who are trying to make decisions about how to utilize vaccines during pregnancy to have a list of all the essential elements to consider vaccinating during pregnancy or during postpartum periods when the mother is lactating. The elements that we are including in this list are important, but they're not necessarily prioritized. So we need to think about all of this when we are considering vaccines, and we should not require that all questions are filled out in order not to delay the onset of clinical trials whenever necessary, for example, on an emergency basis or when there is an emergent pathogen, and also some sites where not enough information is available. So we must be in communication with regulatory groups during the process so that we can have success in the implementation.
I recommend if you have an opportunity to read this. It's a rather large table, but the model used is a way to respond to 5 sets of questions, and these are the key questions. First, on the pathogen, the disease, and pregnancy, what effect does that pathogen or disease have on the pregnant woman, fetus, and newborn? Second, key questions specific to the vaccine platforms or its components, adjuvants, etc., and see what you know about this for non-pregnant people and what are the plans for doing it amongst pregnant people. Next key questions are about information that exists during pregnancy and postpartum period for the product being used. Not a specific vaccine. It might be a set like protein vaccines or vector-based vaccine. What are the various groups? Group D is key questions for post-licensure safety evaluation of vaccine use during pregnancy. What Section E then tries to do is a summary of all these questions. There are like 5 pages of this. I'll show you some examples of what we're looking for here. But Section E, in the end, provides a summary that says, based on everything that we have investigated and the answers we've given, what are the criteria to suggest that the vaccine or product be used in on a pregnant woman or a breastfeeding woman, what criteria would exclude this, and then what needs to continue to be assessed amongst these groups as well, what specific data should be looked for in terms of efficacy and security, and what is the optimal time for part of the pregnancy for vaccination or application. So this is the list that we are proposing. So I would just like to conclude by saying that once the clinical study ends, the researcher's responsibility and the ethics committee's responsibilities do not end, nor does that of the regulatory committee. There must be a specific safety surveillance plan once the vaccine or medicine is rolled out, and we need to have active and passive surveillance as well as enhanced passive surveillance, and we've had a chance to do this. And for pregnancy, for vaccines and medicines applied during pregnancy, we need to have registries. This gives us the real evidence. I also want to stress here that this is a publication from Science in which you can see that there is real-world evidence. This gives the researchers and all decision makers on the use of these vaccines a lot of assurance that we are going to continue to collect information. And for populations such as pregnant women or special populations in which the clinical trials are often small or limited, this type of research that uses large databases and ways to minimize bias, for which you might find important, valid, reliable cases on vaccine safety, is a very important tool for post-licensure monitoring. I'm just sharing something else here with you. Another aspect that we are concerned with is causality. And I've had the opportunity, as you can see with this animated graphic, that this is a preview of what we are preparing. We are incorporating adverse events following maternal immunization, AEFMI. It helps us evaluate the causality of a vaccine or medicine with that adverse event, in addition to symptoms, change in clinical signs, or any other concern that may arise after vaccination. We have included some pregnancy outcomes, such as premature delivery and so forth, and to try to determine whether there is any relationship between this and vaccination. So that's very important as we look to the future. I would just like to finish by stressing what my colleagues have said, and that is that research during pregnancy and lactation has gone through a significant paradigm shift from exclusion to inclusion. And as Carla said, if you're going to exclude pregnant women, this must be explained. And we have seen many cases in which it is relevant to include pregnant women and their fetus or newborn in these clinical studies. Also, we are protecting them through research, not protecting them from research. Our history shows us that if we think we're protecting them from research, we might be excluding them. And also, saving lives of mothers and children must have a path forward, and we know that path exists, and it is our responsibility at this point to apply our knowledge to implement this and move forward. Thank you very much. I stopped sharing my screen. A million thanks. Flor? I think we can already see that there is a lot of material for an excellent discussion. But now we would like to invite Cristiane Santiago Maya, who is a specialist in regulation and health surveillance. She is a nurse with a PhD in health sciences. Dr. Maya Santiago Maya has been working at Anvisa, the Brazilian health regulatory agency, for 20 years, and she represents Anvisa in the expert working group of the ICH E21 guide. And this is what she is going to share with us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Cristiane. You have the floor.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I will share my screen. Just 1 second, please.
Cristiane, we saw you disappear, but you're back again. There you go. Please go ahead. And your mic is muted. Now, there we go. We see you're sharing your slides. Wonderful. Now they just need to be in presentation mode. Great. Go ahead. Cristiane, we don't hear you. You need to turn on your mic, and then
Okay.
There we go.
Is it
Wonderful.
okay now?
Yes, perfect.
Thank you. It's a big pleasure to be here today. I want to thank PAHO for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to talk about the work on the ICH E21. And thank you all very much for being here today. The purpose of this presentation is to discuss the main points for investigations involving pregnant individuals and the challenge for its implementation in accordance with the ICH E21 guideline, which is under public consultation at this moment, and it's very important to have your contribution. Well, I don't know if everyone here is familiarized with the ICH. The ICH means the International Council for Harmonization of Technical Requirements for Pharmaceuticals for Human Use. It brings together the regulatory authorities and pharmaceutical industry to discuss scientific and technical aspects for the drug registrations. This harmonization is achieved by the development of the ICH guidelines, such as this one, the E21. ICH has more than 20 countries represented, and there are some observers, more than 30 institutions. There is the ICH Management Committee. It's a body that oversees the operational aspects of the ICH, and Anvisa is part of this committee. Well, this document has been signed off as a step 2 document. It means that the Assembly agrees and endorses as a draft guideline for the public consultation. It was made based on a concept paper, and the adoption of the guideline is anticipated to happen in the first quarter of 2028. So the objective of the guideline is to provide recommendations for the appropriate inclusion or retention of pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials, and to facilitate the generation of robust clinical data to allow the evidence-based decision-making. That's the main important point of this guideline. On the safe and effective use of medical products by these individuals and their healthcare providers. So the scope of the guidelines includes pre- and post-market clinical trials of investigational products. The definitions used here are the ones that are already described in the E6 guideline. For indications in the general population, such as chronic or acute diseases, and indications specific for pregnant or breastfeeding individuals, such as eclampsia. Now let's see some key messages of this guideline. The first one is that the inclusion of pregnant breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials should be considered for all products where individuals of childbearing potential are among the anticipated user population. It's very important, especially for higher medical needs, but it's not only for this kind of situation. So the proactive planning for obtaining that data and data collection related to the use in pregnancy and breastfeeding through non-clinical and clinical studies should be done from the early stages of formulating the development strategy of the investigational product. So we understand that only this way it will be possible to opportunely identify and address the gaps regarding the drug use in this population. The guideline also recommends to consult with regulatory authority as early as possible and as needed through the investigational product development process. Recommend the early engagement with appropriate stakeholders, including patients, healthcare providers, the family, associations. And every effort should be made to reduce the burden of study procedures on pregnant and breastfeeding study participants. We know that some study procedures have a big impact on the retention of those individuals. Always when possible, it's important to reduce the burden of the study. It's essential to avoid any undue influence or coercion when pregnant or breastfeeding individuals are included in clinical trials. And assessing the safety in pregnant and breastfeeding individuals is complex, and there are potential impact on the fetus and breastfed child to consider. We know it's a complex process, but it's possible and it has to be done. The ongoing safety monitoring of the product used in this population, the post-market period, contributes to the identification of safety signals, especially for rare or delayed outcomes. We know that the safety monitoring of products is a dynamic process, so it has to be done involving several data sources. The available data and assessment of investigational products' benefits and risks during pregnancy and breastfeeding are expected to be included and updated as necessary in the labeling document. It's crucial to update the label whenever new information is generated. So here this slide is just to briefly show you the structure of the E21 guideline. We have a specific section for pregnancy, and the section 5 is about the breastfeeding individuals. About ethical consideration. Include pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials to support safe and effective data-driven use of medicinal products is ethical. We understand that it is supported by the Declaration of Helsinki and by other ICH guidelines, especially the E6 and the E8 guideline. And we highlight that considerations should be given to the use of IRB or ethical committees that are already experienced in working with pregnant and breastfeeding individuals. About the development strategy, the sponsor should anticipate that the approach to include pregnant individuals in clinical trials will require careful assessment of benefits and risks that may evolve depending on multiple factors, including the stage of the clinical development, the duration of the treatment, and the indication being sought, and the strength of the available evidence. This approach may differ based on the anticipated trimester of pregnancy. That's another important point to be considered, of the participants to be included in the clinical trials. The key points to consider when we are talking about the data collection. Incorporate evidence collection for pregnant individuals into the development strategy starts with considering the target condition, the patient population, and the existing treatments to understand if the available treatments has risks or harms to the mother, to the fetus, to the pregnant, if they are efficient or not. Sponsors should consider how pregnancy might affect the disease states, as well as how the patient disease and its treatment could impact the pregnancy and the outcomes, such as miscarriage. Physiological changes may affect absorption, distribution, metabolism, and elimination. That's why we need so many PK and PD data. The data needed to be collected as early as possible during the product development based on the above considerations. And the sponsors are encouraged to evaluate and update the development strategy as new information data become available. The development strategy should aim for early acquisition of data from pregnant individuals, unless there is justification for postponement. So as said before, we need a rationale for do not make the necessary studies to support the understanding of the medical product, the use of the medical product during the pregnancy. So we can change from exclude unless to include unless. So the evidence needed to support the inclusion, the data and the evidence needed for this decision to include this population or to enable ongoing participation of individuals who become pregnant will depend on the weight of the evidence. That's the point here. And have to consider the following: the indication of the intended population, the non-clinical data, the prospective benefit, the clinical pharmacology of the investigational product, the biological plausibility of harm due to pregnancy exposure, when during the pregnancy the investigational product would be administered, in which trimester of the pregnancy, and the novelty of the investigational product, for example, data from treatments similar to this investigational product has to be considered. About non-clinical data, prior to proceeding to studies, including pregnant individuals, the results from relevant non-clinical studies has to be evaluated. The standard developmental and reproductive toxicology, the DART studies, has to be considered, and we refer to other ICH guides specific for this issue. The standard genotoxic studies, appropriately qualified and validated tests, any relevant modeling can be important for those adjustments. And it's important to note that the time and necessity for DART studies may be influenced by several factors. If risks are identified, additional investigations may be assessment, incorporating all the relevant information using a weight of evidence approach. So we understand it needs to be an integrated assessment with all of the relevant information that was generated. In the first scenario, if the sponsor determines that the proceeding with trials in pregnancy is not yet reasonable, then should seek for obtain further data unless there is a rationale for not studying the investigational product in pregnancy. So they have to justify that. For some investigational products, the benefits of using pregnancy may still overweight the potential risks. The second scenario, if the sponsor determines that proceeding with trials in pregnancy is appropriate, then the following approach or actions need to be considered. The recruitment of pregnant individuals into ongoing trials, the removal of mandatory conception requirements, ongoing participation of individuals who become pregnant during the trials, and the implementation of studies specifically designed to be conducted in pregnant individuals, if this is applicable. The study design and safety impact of the pregnancy by all products is used within the trial. So it includes the test and comparator products. It has to be considered. Some additional endpoints, alternate endpoints, or different procedures to assess the endpoints need to be considered for this population. And the participants should be closely monitored for pregnancy-related adverse event with an appropriate management plan if required. The Appendix 2 of the guideline describes additional outcomes that may be used during the study design for this population. The assessment and data collection for pregnant participants and infants. In addition to the study reporting requirements and good clinical practice that we already have described in 6 guidelines, additional outcome parameters may be considered with attention to the disease and condition that's be treated, the investigation of products properties, the duration of use, and the therapeutic context. The duration of the infant follow-up should be considered on a case-by-case basis, so it depends on lots of factors. The duration of infant follow-up should take into consideration that birth defects and functional or neurodevelopment disorders may be diagnosed beyond birth. So there are some mechanisms that can be used to make this follow-up, such as subgroup-specific safety follow-up, for example. For the recruitment and retention, the guidelines recommends engaging with patients, advocacy groups, organizations, managing disease-specific registries, clinicians experienced in conducting research in pregnant individuals before the clinical trial initiation. So it can help to reduce the challenges to recruitment or barriers to participation. The additional time required for follow-up of pregnant infant outcomes may mean that additional efforts are needed to support the retention of the participants. So it means that sometimes we need to discuss more with the participant potential barriers, facilitators for the studies and for the visits. About informed consent, the consent form should clearly state whether ongoing participation will be allowed during pregnancy, and if so, under what conditions, what will change during the trial. It should reflect the potential benefits and risks of the investigational product as applicable in the intended pregnancy trimester of exposure. Participants who have a confirmed pregnancy while enrolling in a clinical trial should be provided with the information to make an informed decision for her and for the fetus. Additional circumstances for reconsent. When the mandatory contraceptives requirement of the trial have been removed during the trial when it's ongoing, and when new information changes the benefits risk assessment as for it happens for every trial. Some considerations. We understand that in alignment with the principles of ICH E21 E8, the approach of collecting data has to involve a systematic expansion of data collection across relevant sources and patient populations. The general principles for clinical trials that are described in E6 guideline apply to pregnant and breastfeeding individuals. And the standard general recommendation on safety evaluation that we have lots of guidelines specifically for that, it applies for studies including pregnant and breastfeeding participants. In the conclusions, we understand that the E21 guideline is a new efficacy guideline intended to provide a globally accepted framework and the best practice to enable the inclusion and retention of pregnant and breastfeeding individuals. These harmonized guidelines will address scientific and high-level regulatory principles. So we understand that we are providing some general principles that will guide the sponsors. And finally, the anticipated changes in our perspective as Anvisa. We understand that it's the establishment of a new paradigm. We are in a process of change, but it can no longer be postponed. We have the example of COVID-19, as were said before, and we understand that we cannot wait more to change site for the public consultation. Here we have the address. Send comments, proposed changes, recommendations. Always when possible, we ask to include the rationale for the contribution. We have different deadlines for the comments, depending on the country. And the ICH encourage to submit the comments to the respective regulatory authorities, but the stakeholders can also provide the comments by email to the ICH Secretariat. Here we have the address. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Cristiane. So I am glad now to invite my colleague Sara Carracedo from PAHO's Regional Program on Bioethics. And Sara will moderate today's discussion. And so Sara is a bioethicist that works with PAHO's Regional Program on Bioethics. And you may know her from previous activities. And I'll pass the mic to her, but before that, I'll invite our other speakers, Carly, Flor, and Cristiane, to join us in this conversation.
Gracias, Carla, y gracias a todas ustedes por sus
Thank
presentaciones.
you, Carla, and thank you
Hay
all the
varias
presenters.
preguntas,
There are
en el chat,
several
así que
questions
tal vez voy a empezar con
on
cosas
the
un poco más
chat, and I'll
generales para
start with
luego ir
some
a
general
cuestiones más
questions, and then
específicas.
I'll
Y la
proceed to
primera
more specific
es
issues.
sobre
The
la
first question
inclusión
has to
de
do
mujeres
with
embarazadas.
including
La
pregnant
inclusión
persons.
responsable de mujeres
Responsibly
embarazadas
including
en las
pregnant
investigaciones
persons
debe
in
limitarse
research should be
solamente
limited
a mujeres embarazadas
only
enfermas,
to
o es que
pregnant
también
women who
deberíamos
are
incluir
sick or
a
ill, or
embarazadas
should we
sanas.
also include healthy pregnant people? So the question is, should be including pregnant women who are
Para todas,
ill
por favor,
or
vamos conversando.
healthy. The question is for all of you, not anyone in particular. I can start. This is an interesting question, actually. It allows us to take a look at the different objectives of running a clinical trial. The idea is to maintain health in the mother and the neonate, or the infant. So regarding vaccination, of course, they are prophylactic, they are preventive. They are given to healthy people, and pregnancy is not an illness. It's not a condition to exclude vaccination. So in the case of vaccines, pregnant people are healthy people, and vaccines can be given as long as they don't have exclusion criteria. If they are within the age group, but if there are certain criteria exclusions, then that's another thing, but they can participate. But the question is interesting, and I would like to hear what others have to say, because of course there are some pathologies, some illnesses for which medications are necessary, and many times we do not have data about pregnant women and their reaction to these medicines. It could be high blood pressure medications, or antibiotics, or many kinds of products that and what I think is that we should include pregnant persons in these trials, because if they are going to benefit from the interventions, then they should participate in the research. Yes, Carly, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think just picking up on Flora's point that particularly for the types of interventions that are prophylactic or preventive, I mean, you will be enrolling healthy pregnant women. And this was a big question that we had in some of our work around HIV, particularly for pre-exposure prophylaxis for PrEP. So we actually did a lot of both sort of guidance development, but also engagement with pregnant or recently pregnant women around their receptivity, their interest in participating in studies, whether it was people who were living with HIV and a new theoretical antiretroviral versus prophylactically for something like an oral PrEP. And a lot of it really came down to, from their perspective, how at risk they felt and whether or not what would be best for both their health and the health of their babies. So if people had a partner that was living with HIV and they thought they were at high risk of potentially getting HIV in pregnancy, and we know that in that case as well, there's a much higher viral load, a higher likelihood of vertical transmission. They were much more receptive to that because it was both in the best interest of their health and their babies. So just even from the user perspective, from the potential participant perspective, there was significant interest in doing that. Similarly, for flu vaccines, there has been a lot of qualitative studies done with pregnant women to understand their interest, and very much so because they sort of understand that the risk both to them and their babies is significant. But again, it really does depend on the type of intervention, the type of condition you're talking about, prophylaxis versus treatment. It's obviously a much easier case to say, well, you're already ill, we need to figure out how to control this, or you're already going to be taking medication, let's figure out what the dosing looks like, which is sort of the optimal type of medication, or something new that doesn't yet have any approved drugs. But yeah, I think when we're talking globally about the whole research space, it's difficult to kind of come up with one size fits all, because you really do have to take on a case by case. But where there's a prospect of direct benefit, which occurs both for healthy women who are at risk of either infection or some health threat that you want to prevent, that's also true for women who are already living with an illness.
Yo quería agregar un comentario porque creo que entiendo de dónde
I
puede venir
wanted
esta pregunta
to
específica.
add a comment, because I may know where this question is coming from. For a publication, which is already older, from about 10 years ago, where we gathered information from several countries in the region, both for pregnancy or research and infants and children, and for some countries. And the language that is included in regulatory writing, and given the participation of these groups of people in cases where there was already disease, if the women were already ill. So we supported national authorities as PAHO, both the authorities that are in charge of overseeing all ethics committees as well as regulatory authorities. We encourage them to develop new regulations and revise the existing regulations. And one of the things we did with respect to this is the following. First, we drew attention to vaccines as preventive intervention. So automatically they would be excluded using that language. And we all understand that increasingly the population who we consider healthy may have some chronic diseases. So we cannot leave those populations outside receiving any health alternatives. So this is why pregnant women, children, and all those other populations that generally are excluded, they should be included in all kinds of research that can affect them, either for preventive interventions, diagnostic testing, therapeutic interventions, etc. The second point is that as part of that work, what we sought was to have regulatory frameworks in the countries to be consistent with international standards. So if you do a review of all the countries who have standards that have been more recently revised, you have a different language. There's not enough detail about specific things. So there's a more generalization so that there is more ethical inclusion of pregnancy persons. So no concrete cases. It's not like the safety belts, which we always need to wear when we are in the car, but in the case of inclusion of these populations, we need to evaluate them in each concrete case, and we need to do for each case the analysis of risk versus benefit, etc. So
Gracias,
I wanted
Carla,
to add that.
también.
Thank
Hay una pregunta
you,
muy
Carla.
específica
There is a very
que
specific
es
question
sobre
here
el proceso de
about
consentimiento
the
informado.
consent,
Carly
the informed
mencionó algo de esto
consent
en su
process.
presentación y quizás
Carly
podamos
mentioned
ahondar
something
un poquito
about
más.
this in her presentation. Maybe
Pero
we
¿por
could go
qué
deeper
solo debe
regarding this
estar
question.
o
Why
debe ser realizado el proceso de consentimiento
should
informado
the
a la
informed
mujer
consent
embarazada y no
form
al
should be given
esposo, a la
only
pareja,
to
al
the
cónyuge, al
pregnant
novio,
person,
lo que
but
sea?
not to the partner, whether a spouse, a companion,
Estaba para Carly, creo,
whatever. And I
fue
think
que
the question is
mencionó.
for Carly. She's the one who mentioned that.
Yeah, so again, this is one of those things where sometimes in the case we've used the term vessels and vectors. We overlook the personhood of the woman herself when she's pregnant. And in many of these cases, there are direct benefits that affect not just her health, but her babies. And so it would be unethical to deny her that respect for her autonomy to enroll. Now, that doesn't mean that if she wants to talk to her partner about the decision, that she or whoever else in her family or trusted support group, of course, there should be opportunities to make that decision as informed as she wants to be. But to take that decision away from her can be really problematic. And I think what's really interesting is there's a quirk in the regulations. I'll use the word quirk is the nicest way I can talk about it. But so if we talk about pediatric research, so a lot of times the reason that this was assumed is like, oh, well, you need to make sure that the father is involved as well for the consent of the fetus who can't consent on their own behalf. When we look at pediatric research, you actually only need one parent to consent on behalf of the child, the born child. So there's something going on there where suddenly people writing the regulations and setting the guidance way back when um, didn't think that the pregnant woman had the best interest of the fetus in mind to serve as a solo parent if of an unborn child. And it's I think, incredibly even more disrespectful because we know that almost no one has more of an interest in safeguarding the health and well-being of a developing baby than the mother. So not only is it an injustice and a disrespect to her for her own sake, but also as a future parent who does have the best interest of her baby at heart, to deny her that privilege. So yeah, out of respect and also really just to give the same respect that we would afford any parent, to be able to consent on behalf of their child or unborn child or developing fetus, depending on how you're doing that. So again, not to bar opportunities to make shared decision where and when that is appropriate, but it can really get in the way of women who want to enroll in studies being denied that opportunity, that fair access.
¿Puedo hacerle comentario, Sara? Porque, de nuevo, en mi posición
Let me comment because in my position as chair of two ethics committees in my university and my research work, it's important to clarify this point because we're all in favor of inclusion of children and pregnant people and other groups as well of special populations who for some reason need additional protection. So to clarify here, in fact, regarding medical care, and I am talking about research, medical care, the pregnant person has full autonomy to decide by themselves to guarantee for themselves and their fetuses. And as a parent, as a mother, they have the right and ability to decide for the born child. In many cases, a minor may not have that ability, even though they're pregnant. So there are legal nuances too. When you talk about research, this is a little different because when we talk about research, we're talking about research in humans whose objective is to collect information, learn something, do an intervention, look for treatment, prophylaxis, etc. So there is a point, an objective, and it's outside the realm of regular healthcare. So if you're trying to protect the rights of the mother and the special populations, the children, for many years there was no protection and these populations were abused somehow. So there are different risk categories, as mentioned by Carly, depending on the risk that you are going to include. So have category one minimum risk. It's like nothing special. Category two and category three, where category three means that there may be no benefit and instead there be a lot of risk. And so that's why I wanted to clarify this here because there is the default option is to allow participation and that in every situation the mother will sign for her and the fetus if there is potential benefit for her and the baby if it's only her. But when we are considering a high risk, where, for example, it'll involve surgery, etc., if there is not a clear, obvious benefit either for the mother or the baby, then you also respect the father's right because the father has a decision to make regarding the fetus that is growing. And this is where both father and mother are sign. Also in pediatrics research, if the risk is very high, you need both signatures, not only one of the parents. But, and the last point I want to make is there are ways in which you can still allow for participation in cases where it is well designed and designated, where the father is not present or the father is not compos mentis for some reason, or if the father is in jail, if that parent is not accessible, there are options to consider that even though the situations are high risk where you require both signatures, you can still leave the decision to the mother alone. Thank you.
A ver, yo quería agregar desde el lado de las pautas de CIOMS que son bastante
From the
claras en
CIOM's
decir que el
guidelines, I wanted to
consentimiento de
say
la
that
madre
mother's
que la mujer
consent of
embarazada
the
es lo que debe
pregnant woman
bastar el
is
tribunal
what
para la
should
investigación del embarazo.
suffice
El
for
embarazo es una situación
pregnancy
sumamente compleja,
research.
pero
Pregnancy
cualquier
is a
cosa que
complex
es un evento que
situation,
pasa
but
en el cuerpo de
whatever
una
it
persona.
is an
Entonces
event
es
that
una
happens in the
preparación.
body of a
Entonces
person
hacen
who's a
atención a ello
pregnant
con las
person.
pautas de
And
CIOMS y
it is
dicen
bearing this in mind that the CIOM guidelines
la tome
say that the
la mujer.
the
Es
decision
la
to
mujer
participate
embarazada que es
should
quien
be
está
made by the
participando en la
pregnant person
investigación,
who is
incluso si la
participating in the
investigación
research,
pueda tener
even
un
if the
impacto para
research
la
can
salud y la
have
vida
impact on the health of the fetus
entonces,
or not.
evidentemente
So,
en todas las
obviously, in
relaciones,
all
cada vez que una mujer embarazada está en
relationships,
una relación
each
sana,
time
pues consultará
a
con
pregnant woman is in a healthy relationship, they
los
will
pareja,
probably
sea su
consult with
esposo
their
o quien fuera su
partner,
pareja.
spouse, or
En
life
relación al
companion,
punto que
whatever.
mencionaba
So,
Flor de
regarding what
menores,
Flor was saying
también las
regarding
pautas de CIOMS
minors,
insisten que
the
así como hablamos de
CIOM
menores
guidelines
emancipados, o que a pesar de ser
talk about the
menores de
fact
edad,
that there are
son
emancipated minors. Despite the
independientes,
fact that they're
a mí me
minors,
parece que
they
es
are
algo clave,
independent.
porque entiendo que viven por su
If
cuenta.
they were married or
El
if
embarazo,
they
de
live
acuerdo a
on their
muchas
own,
leyes, es
pregnancy, according
considerado
to
una
many
razón para
laws, is considered
emanciparse.
a reason to become
Y,
emancipated. And
desde el lado de las
from the
orientaciones éticas, la
standpoint
recomendación
of
siempre es sean
ethical
esta joven
situations,
embarazada,
uh,
aunque sea
it-
menor,
even if
decida por sí
the
misma.
person is
A veces no es
minor,
posible
that
permitir
person should
la
make
ética intrauterina que nos
decisions
dice lo que la ley debería hacer.
if they're
Es mucho
pregnant.
trabajo que todavía
There's still a
seguir
lot of
haciendo.
work to
Y
do
tenemos
and to
que,
continue to find
en
out what the
general,
best ethical
se
options are.
recomienda
And
para las
we need to
investigaciones
amend some
pediátricas
things
que
for
baste
pediatric
un
research.
padre por un tema
Uh,
también de equidad.
one
Evidentemente, en las relaciones en que están
signature
bien
is enough
saludables, donde hay un padre
in
involucrado,
healthy
se
relationships
buscará
where the father
participación
is
de ambos.
involved.
Pero lo que
Yes,
sabemos es que
it is
cuando
sought to
no,
have
cuando
participation
se
by both.
requiere
But
que
what we know is that
ambos
when
padres participen,
both parents
de facto se está
are
excluyendo a las
required
personas
to
más pobres,
participate, de
cuyos
facto, you're
dos padres no
excluding
pueden
poorer
tomarse un día
people
sin
whose
trabajar
two parents
para
many
ir a la
times cannot take days
cita médica.
off to attend
Entonces, creo
medical
que
appointments, etc. So
idealmente es lo que siempre se
ideally,
desea, lo que se busca,
that's what
pero hay
we
situaciones
would
en que no es posible.
want to
Puede
have, but
ser que
there are
no sea
situations
el
where
jefe quien
it's
es
not
el padre.
possible,
Puede
and
ser que el
sometimes we
padre no
don't even
esté
know who the
involucrado
parent, who the father
el,
is. Many times the father is not
el
involved
crecimiento del
in
niño, que no tenga una
the
relación
growth and
con él.
development of the
Por
child.
eso
They may not
es
have a
importante que las
relationship with the child.
trabajadoras que hay
And
que
this is why
poner
what Flor
atención
said
a
was
estas
very
a esta
pertinent. We need to
complejidad
pay attention to these
de los
complexities
escenarios
of the
que
different
pueden darse,
scenarios
¿no?
that can
Por
happen.
eso
And
nosotros cuando
for
trabajamos
this
con las
reason,
autoridades
whenever
nacionales
we work
revisando las
with the national
normativas,
authorities reviewing
siempre nos hacemos esta pregunta,
regulations, we
invitamos a que
always
todos hagan
ask
esta
ourselves this
pregunta.
question, and we invite people to
En el
ask
caso ideal,
themselves this question.
lo
In
que uno puede
the
estar escribiendo
ideal
en la norma va a
situation,
ser
what we are
perfecto,
writing
pero el trabajo de hacer la normativa no
in a
es pensar en
regulation
todos
could
los
be
casos
perfect,
en
but
que
the
las cosas
work
pueden ir
involves
de manera
thinking of all the
distinta a como
cases where
uno la
things may
requiere.
turn
Y una vez
out
que lo
to be
requiere
different, all the
como,
twists that may
como
happen in life.
una restricción
And
legal, entonces no hay vuelta que
if
darle.
we're thinking in
Es
terms
distinto
of
es
legal
fantástico que los comités de
restrictions,
ética
then
tenemos la
that's a
oportunidad de
different
ir
story.
protocolo por protocolo, analizar el
Ethics
caso
committees
concreto,
can
tomar en
analyze
cuenta
case by
el
case
riesgo, las
concretely each
complejidades,
case,
el
take into
tipo de
account risk,
investigación y
complexities, the
dar
kind of research, and can
una
provide
orientación más
more refined orientation, case by case. But sometimes when the law is very specific, it closes the door on a finer, fine-tuned analysis, which is the core of ethics
Gracias por las
analyses.
intervenciones.
Thank you.
Nos
Thank you very
queda poco
much for your
tiempo
interventions.
y,
We have a little
y
time
todavía
left,
hay varias, así
and we
que
still have
quisiera
some
ir a
questions,
una
but I
que
would like to
está
now
más
ask a
dirigida
question, which is
a Cristian, que
for
es sobre la
Christian,
ICH.
and it is
Lo que
about
nos dicen es,
ICH, and what they
en los
ask is
estudios
in the
farmacocinéticos, en los cuales se va a
pharmacokinetic
determinar
studies,
el volumen de distribución y
where you
dosis,
will have the
cuando se
volumes of
hagan
distribution
estos
and doses be
estudios
determined,
con
when those
mujeres
studies
embarazadas,
are done with
estos
pregnant
se van a hacer,
persons,
se prevé el
will
uso de
these
modelos
studies use
computacionales para simular la distribución de
computation models
medicamentos,
or computer
o es
models,
que se van a realizar las
or are you
investigaciones
going to
con las
do the
mujeres embarazadas.
research
Esta información
on
es
pregnant
relevante
women?
para las autoridades regulatorias.
Is this
Entonces, tal
relevant
vez,
for
Cristian, nos puedas decir algo al respecto.
regulatory authorities? So maybe, Christian, you
Yes, thank you
could
for
tell us
the
something about
question.
it.
That's a very important point for the dose adjustment for the trials with pregnant individuals. And modeling, yes, it's a source of information for the definition of those. Modeling, non-clinical studies, studies with no pregnant individuals, all of this data must to be considered together to define the dose, and the dose can be reviewed during the development process.
Gracias por la respuesta. Tengo
Thank
otra
you for your
pregunta.
answer.
Flor ha hecho
I have
alusiones a este tema
another
en algún
question. Flor
momento
has
de su participación,
referred
pero
to
quizás
this
podamos
during her
ir a
presentation, but
más
perhaps we could
detalles. Y lo que sucede es
take
que
a deeper
generalmente
dive.
en los protocolos de ensayos
Generally,
clínicos, el
in
embarazo
clinical
es
trial
una
protocols,
razón para la
pregnancy
exclusión
is a
inmediata
reason
de mujeres
to
que ya se encuentran
immediately
participando en
exclude
una
people who are
investigación.
already
Entonces,
participating
¿qué
in a research study.
consideraciones debería
So,
tener un
what
comité de ética
considerations should
cuando
an
la
ethics
revisión de un
committee
estudio
take into
se
account when
encuentra con esta
reviewing a
exclusión
study and they
automática
find
de
this
mujeres por
default
el embarazo?
exclusion of women who become pregnant?
Tal vez para darles la perspectiva
Okay, to give
de por
you
qué existe esa
the perspective
exclusión,
of why that
que
exclusion
usualmente estamos
exists.
hablando de
And
estudios de
usually we're
fase
talking
1
about
o
phase
fase
one
2, que son
studies
los
or
estudios
phase two
iniciales
studies. These are
para
initial phase
saber
trials
cómo está
to
funcionando un
know
medicamento, una
how a
vacuna por
medication
primera
is
vez en un
working
ser
or
humano.
a vaccine is
Recuerden que se
working for
hicieron
the
los
first time
estudios
on a human being
preclínicos,
after
es la
preclinical
primera vez que van
studies.
a las personas
This is
en
the first
general.
time that they
Esto es
are
una
being
forma de
given to
proteger
people.
a
So
las
it's a
mujeres
way to
embarazadas y
protect
proteger a los
women
fetos y los
who are
niños. Por eso
pregnant
es
and
que ellos
protecting
no son los
fetuses and
primeros que van a
children.
estar
That's why
evaluados.
they're not
Es
the
una
first ones
forma
to be
tradicional,
evaluated. It is a
diría yo,
traditional
de cuando hay
way
un
to do
producto
it.
nuevo
So when we have
para
a new
atención
product to
médica
test
que requiera
for
de
healthcare, a
evaluación
product that needs to
saber la
be
dosis, el
assessed in
perfil de
terms of
seguridad,
dose
saber
and
su
safety
efectividad,
profile,
hacer algún tipo de
effectiveness,
seguimiento sobre
and follow
coadministración,
up
qué sé yo,
on
diferentes cosas, ¿no?
co-administration or whatever else.
Tradicionalmente, los
Traditionally,
grupos
the
seleccionados son sanos, personas
groups
sanas
that are
con
chosen are
mínimo o ningún
healthy
tipo de
people
comorbilidad
with
y de una edad en
minimum
donde se espera que
comorbidities, and
tengan
their age is
probabilidad de que tengan cosas del adulto joven convencional,
usually
los
within a
18 a
range
los
where
40
it's like
años,
from
desde
18 to
25 años
40,
empiezan los
45 years of
ensayos
age,
clínicos.
where they
Y
won't
una vez
have
esos
any
datos se tienen,
age-related
entonces
disease. And
la
so
idea de
once the
nuevo es,
data are
dependiendo
obtained,
de la razón por la cual
the
se quiere
idea
dar
is
un medicamento,
uh,
una vacuna en una embarazada, para
depending
protegerla a
on
ella,
the
para proteger al
reason
niño,
why
hay ninguna
you
necesidad
are
inmediata.
selecting
Poder
this
abrir esos estudios lo
medication
más
or
tempranamente
vaccine,
posible, ya después de esos
you
datos mínimos, para
have to
niños,
collect minimum
embarazadas y adulto
data
mayor. Eso lo vimos en el
for
COVID, por
being
ejemplo,
able
¿no?
to
En un caso
apply to the
de esos
special
para grupos de riesgos
populations
de adultos
of
mayores
the
o
elderly,
grupos
children,
sensitivos
and
o
pregnant
grupos
women.
socioeconómicos desfavorecidos, de
And we
desarrollo
saw
inferior,
that
y
with
luego se va
COVID,
bajando
where
la edad
special
y se va
groups
incluyendo
started to be included.
las embarazadas igual.
So you
Yo creo que
started
habría
to
que
include
considerar
older
muy
people first, and
específicamente
then
para los productos en
children were
general,
left for the end.
a
But
menos de que
for
sean específicos
general
para el
situations,
embarazo,
unless they are specific
usualmente
for pregnancy, Usually,
la trayectoria de evaluación, esperar a tener ciertos datos
that's the
nuevos
assessment. You
para
wait
saber
for
luego
having
secundaria.
first some data on non-pregnant people, and then you can include pregnant people
Gracias.
in the trial.
¿Alguien
Thank you.
más quisiera agregar
Anybody else would
algo
like
a
to
esto de la
add
exclusión
something else
automática
regarding
en los protocolos
default
de ensayos
exclusion
clínicos?
for the protocols
¿Y
of
qué es lo que
clinical
debería hacer un
trials,
comité
and
frente a
what
esta
an
situación?
ethics committee should do vis-a-vis this situation?
Quizás muy brevemente, Sara,
Yeah, maybe
compartir,
briefly,
porque como estamos tan
let
justitos con el
me
tiempo,
share
compartí
this.
el enlace
We are running out of
que decíamos
time,
la
but
página
I
específica.
have shared the
La idea es que
CIOM's
no debe haber
page
más una
with the
exclusión
specific
autónoma.
information. There
Tiene
should
que
not
haber una
be
exclusión
an
evaluada.
automatic
En el caso de
exclusion.
que haya
Every time
alguna
you want to
razón
exclude, you
para
have to assess the situation.
creer
If there is reason to
para creer
believe
se
that
la participación pueda suponer un daño para la
participation
mujer embarazada o
may
el feto,
bring
se debe
harm to the
proceder
pregnant
a
person or the
excluir a la
fetus,
persona.
then
En el
the
caso de que
person is
no haya
excluded. In the
razón para
case that there
suponer que
is
eso puede
no
tener un
reason
daño,
to believe that
entonces
there will be
se
harm
debe
done
poder
to the
ofrecer a la mujer
mother
embarazada
or
la
the fetus,
oportunidad de evaluar
you
si
should
quiere
be able to
continuar su
offer
participación
the
o no.
possibility to the pregnant
Quizás como
woman
estamos ya
to
con
continue
apenas
to participate or
unos minutos
not.
libres, voy a
We
usar
have a
esta
few more
oportunidad
minutes left, and
para
I'm going
redondear
to
una idea
use this
central
opportunity
sobre
to
esto, sobre
give you a
la
central
inclusión ética de las
point about
embarazadas y
ethical
los niños
inclusion
y las personas
of
mayores
pregnant
en
people and
investigación.
children and
Y es
the
que
elderly in
ya
research
no podemos seguir
studies.
usando
And it is this,
soluciones
we
únicas.
cannot
No
continue
es
to use
éticamente
one size
aceptable
fit all
excluir categóricamente a las
solutions.
embarazadas.
It is
No
not
es
ethical
éticamente
to
aceptable excluir
categorically
categóricamente a los niños o a las
exclude
personas mayores.
pregnant women,
Las
children.
exclusiones
Those
deben ser
exclusions
justificadas.
should be
El
warranted
comité
and
ética debe
justified. The
recibir una
ethics committee
propuesta, la autoridad
receiving a
regulatoria que reciba
proposal
una propuesta tiene
or the
que recibir una
regulatory authority
explicación
receiving
sobre
that
por
should
qué se
also
está
receive
excluyendo
an explanation of why
cada grupo
each
específico.
specific group is
Y
being
si no,
excluded.
si
And
ustedes
if not,
no
if
reciben
you do
una
not
explicación de esa
receive
naturaleza,
an
pues tienen que hacer la
explanation
pregunta.
of that nature, then you
Entonces,
have to
creo que alguien
ask the
preguntaba, ¿cómo vamos
question.
a cambiar
So
la situación en la que estamos
we
ahora?
are not going
Vamos
to
a cambiar
change
esta
the
situación
situation where
haciendo
we are
juntos,
now. We are
haciendo estas
the only way we're
preguntas,
going to change the
forzándonos
situation
todos
is
a
if we
evaluar
ask the questions, if we
rigurosamente un
force
análisis
ourselves to
ético
rigorously
detallado y
evaluate
ahora
and
a la luz
assess
de las
with an
nuevas pautas que se
ethical
perfilan de ICH,
procedure that is
también desde el lado
detailed. And
regulatorio,
also from the
hacer una evaluación más
regulatory side,
granular
we need to
de
do a more
en qué situaciones
granular
podemos o
assessment
debemos
to
asegurar que se
determine
incluyan
what
a las personas
situations warrant
Muchísimas
that
gracias
pregnant
por su
people are
participación.
included. Thank you very
Vamos
much for
a,
your
creo que ha quedado
participation.
claro que tenemos
And
que
I think it
continuar
is
conversando
clear
sobre este
that
tema
we need to
y,
continue to talk
y
about this
vamos
topic. And we are
enviar la
going
grabación
to
por medio de
send
la
you
lista
the
investigación
recording
ética. Vamos a
to
enviar
the
también una
mail
serie de recursos que se
list,
han
and we will
compartido
send you some
para que todos
resources
los
that
tengan
we have been
y,
sharing. And
vamos a
also,
compartir
we're
dentro de esos
going
recursos
to
también un
share
enlace de la consulta
the
pública de ICH que nos
ICH
presentó
public
Cristian. Muchísimas gracias, que
consultation
tengan una excelente
presented by one of the
tarde.
panelists. Thank you very much and good afternoon. Bye-bye.